welcome to this live Q&A all about exploring the Fivefold Ministries. My name's Rosie and I'll be your host for today. And can you all, if you're watching, can you please let me know if you can hear me okay? I just always like to check that it's all working. If you could let me know, that would be amazing. We have 3 amazing guests coming in today. And I shall just bring them in. So, first of all, we have Scott Brennan from the St. Hilda and Aiden community. Hi, Scott. How are you doing?
Hi, Rosie. Good to be with you.
Great to have you on the panel. And we also have Heather Sutherland, Director of Training for Streams in Scotland. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, Rosie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to have you, Heather. And finally, we have John Thomas, President of Streams Ministries. Welcome, John.
Welcome. So glad to be here. Thanks for having us. Excited to see where this goes.
I am so excited as well. And yes, we have Sid and Graceful and Mina saying that they can hear us. So that is great. So we can start. I actually don't know exactly what I would do if people ever said, I can't hear you. However, it's always good to know that they can. Okay, shall we just jump right in with our questions? So, first of all, why do we even need to study and discuss this topic, the Fivefold Ministries? Heather, would you like to share on that?
Thanks, Rosie. Yeah, I think in the Western Church for a good couple of centuries, if not even longer, we have been really good at focusing on people who are teachers and pastors. And there's an expectation that if they want to have those roles within church congregations, then they'll go off and they'll do 3 or 4 years theological training and they'll be officially equipped and all this kind of thing. But we tend to have misplaced emphasis on prophets and evangelists and apostles. You know, they haven't had the same emphasis within congregations and bigger denominations. So what's happened is that people who've maybe had these giftings or have experienced, you know, my natural bent is to be in the sort of prophetic realm. If I go to some church leaders like I have in the past, then they don't really understand where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to explain about what I've experienced. And I know that for some other people, this has meant that they have then left the church because they've been told that, you know, what you're experiencing and what you're hearing, that's not from God. And so I've found these people in places like New Age fairs and body and soul events, and because they were told that the church wasn't where they fitted. So I think that's why it's really important that we need to discuss the Fivefold Ministries rather than just the 2 that have been predominant in Western culture, as I say, for the last couple of centuries. And I think it's really good that we're now getting to that point where people are talking about, well, what does it mean to operate as a prophet? What does it mean to be an evangelist within a church setting? What does it mean to be an apostle? And finding ways for us all to work together with the pastors and teachers, not to say that we don't want them anymore, because we still need them. But that's kind of my thoughts on that particular question.
Thanks, Heather. So it's really about the current landscape in the Western Church and the focus on some aspects, meaning a need to discuss them all and bring them all forward. Thank you, Heather. Would anybody else like to add anything on that?
Sure, I'm happy to say. I think the thing for me it's the Ephesians 4 passage that captured me, because it talks about 3 things that look like maturity and Christ likeness. It talks about unity, diversity, and maturity. And if that's what Christ looks like, surely we need all 5 of those things in the church. So we want Christ-likeness, but we also want unity, diversity, and maturity. So it seems to me that the biblical perspective is that if you want those things, if you want Christ-likeness, then you need all 5. And so to dismiss them seems a little short-sighted to me.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, that's really something to think about, really rich there as well. And John, would you like to?
Yeah, as at one point I was trying to study and get a good feel for what the 5 were, and I happened upon this interesting article. It had nothing to do with the fivefold, but it was just talking about the gospel. It was talking about the redemption that we have. And the person that was writing it was explaining how there were 5 different aspects of the redemption that Jesus accomplished that were all necessary. He was fully God, he was fully man. So the incarnation, God himself took on flesh and became man. If he wasn't God and if he wasn't man, the redemption could not have happened. The fact that Jesus lived sinless, like he was tempted in every way just as we were, but he was without sin. He never gave in to the enemy in any way. His sinless life, what was absolutely essential. If he had not been sinless, he would have submitted to the enemy. He would not have been able to accomplish redemption. The fact that he died an innocent death. He actually was killed. Death touched him. And the death on the cross, without the death, there's no redemption. There's no the shedding of blood. There's no forgiveness. He had to actually die, and he had to raise from the dead. He had to be resurrected. Without the resurrection, again, he would have just remained dead. He could have just been any other teacher that was out there, but he did actually rise from the dead. He is still alive today. And then the 5th part is the ascension, that he's sitting at the right hand of the Father. Now, this was not the guy's point, but as he's talking about these 5 aspects, I realized, wait a second, that's all 5 of these ministries in order. You have the teacher who helps us to put, well, I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with the ascension. You have the apostle that helps us, that teaches us how to walk in the authority that Christ has, how to live that ascended life and live in the kingdom. You have the prophet that's constantly pointing towards life after death, that there's something greater, that the power of God can break in, that there's a reality that is bigger than the reality that we see. You have the evangelist that's constantly calling us to the cross for repentance, for the forgiveness of sins. You have the pastor that is teaching us how to live this life out in the flesh, in community with other people. And then you have the teacher that's putting flesh on spiritual realities and helping us to see these 2 dynamics, the reality of God, the reality of man, and how those come together and what that means to our life. We have all 5 of those aspects. Without any of one of those 5, we've missed it all. And so we need all 5 of them. And this understanding, it helps keep us anchored in Christ, which I think is the whole point of, what Scott was mentioning earlier about coming to that fullness of the stature of Christ.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, and it really links back to what you were saying as well, Scott. If you're watching just now, we're talking about the Fivefold Ministries, and you are really welcome to comment with any thoughts on what anyone is saying, and also please ask us your questions, because we will be coming to your questions too. So I have another question here for you. Do we actually need to be one of them? I mean, what if I look at them and I think, I don't feel like an apostle, I don't feel like a teacher, I'm not evangelizing right now, what if you don't feel like you're any? Do we have to be one of them? Scott, would you like to share about that?
Well, it probably ties into Catherine's question that's come up. She said, how do we avoid putting people in boxes, but at the same time fully embrace all 5? I did the questionnaire, 1 came out highest, but a lot of the scores came quite close to each other. So my view is that we have the Spirit of Christ, that, it's Christ in us, the hope of glory, and he is fully expressing all 5, the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the shepherd, the teacher. And so therefore, if it's Christ in us, that Christ DNA is within us, which means that all 5 is within us. Now, what's interesting is that from the Western perspective, we tend to put things into boxes, including our self and our personalities. So we might do a Myers-Briggs, or we might do some other kind of, test. So what Catherine said is, how do we avoid putting people in boxes? Well, I think that's a really important question, because I think all of us have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to these 5-fold. There is something really helpful about understanding our strengths. And so I don't actually think we are one or the other. I think we are all 5, because it's Christ that we are becoming most like. But we develop our strengths, and then we also become stronger in other areas as seasons of life happen. So in response to Catherine, it'd be interesting to know what was her strongest that came out. Because what you often find is that apostolic people are more like the kind of the thumb in the 5-fold. They're able to touch the other 4, so there's a mixture. So I don't know if she wants to respond to that, Rosie.
Yeah, Catherine. Yeah, respond and let us know if you feel like Scott's answered your question. See, when you were mentioned, I hadn't looked to the comments at that point, and when you were talking about Catherine, I was like, so here's Catherine's question. I see what you mean about the boxes. Brilliant. Let us know. She's saying prophetic now. Yeah. Great. Thanks for answering that one, Scott. John, did you want to comment on any of the questions either online or this one here about, do we have to be either one?
Yeah, I mean, well, tying into what Scott was saying, every time I go through this, trying to figure out, so am I more apostle, am I more prophetic, am I more evangelist? I end up with all 5 of them. Like I have not been able to separate and settle on one, because it really depends on the season. It depends on the need. It depends on the role that I'm in. Like I've seen in different seasons, all 5 of these having a priority in different seasons, but there tends to be this growth. And I like how Scott was saying, like we need to be all 5 because Jesus was all 5. And that's been one of the things that I've been trying to really press into, instead of trying to figure out what is necessarily my strongest in the moment. I want to figure out which one is my weakest and figure out how to strengthen that, so that I can become more like Jesus. Because my goal is not to figure out how to be a great apostle or how to be a great prophet or how to be a great evangelist or pastor or teacher. My goal is to figure out how to be a good follower of Jesus. I want to look like him in everything that we do. I do think that there are going to be certain people that will have a very particular role that actually is a longer term role. It's something that they get to do for the church. But it's interesting, in Ephesians 4, it says, and some are given, which means every believer is not given in these particular roles, though every believer has access to the grace of all of them because we have Jesus. But there are some, and I actually think that it's a small number of people that actually have these as a function, if you will, or as a very particular role. It's what they do for the body of Christ that Jesus has put them in place. And it says, and he himself gave. So there's something of Jesus appointing that person to that role. And, I'm leading Streams Ministries, started by John Paul Jackson. One of the things that he said, someone that gets into that place, that they get into that place because the Lord Jesus comes into the physical realm and lays hands on that person and appoints them to a particular role. And when that happens, there's a huge shift that happens in how people respond to that person, the anointing that's on their life, what we call gifting, the influence, the power, the manifestation of heaven. That there's a shift that happens at that point in time. But that is not nearly as common as a lot of people think, because it's not about the few that we need to know about this. It's because every single one of us has access to these graces, and we get to live it out in our lives.
Wow, I like that distinction between the graces and almost like a role, because I think sometimes we do think of them as roles rather than just how we're wired or how we're operating. And I liked your challenge, John. So I know I can't just have an excuse of, oh, if I'm quite low in shepherd, that's okay. I don't need to care too much. No, it's like I do need to care about people. So Catherine is saying that was a really helpful answer there. So thank you, Scott. And we've got Karen saying amen, and Charity is saying great explanations for the fivefold. Okay, so you mentioned, Scott, actually, you mentioned about a questionnaire. And so there is a 5Q quiz that you can do online. What is it? What is 5Q? And is this quiz that's available worth doing? Scott, since you mentioned the questionnaire, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've tended to use it. There's a phrase that gets used, which is base and phase. So that kind of ties into what John was referring to, that someone probably has a base gift. So in terms of fivefold, my base gift tends to shift between apostle and evangelist, depending on the context and the season. So it's good to know what base you have, and it's good to know what phase that you're in. So the 5Q quiz just gives you the kind of foundational understanding of, this is where I'm strong, this is where I'm weak. Where it's really, really good is with teams. So if you're working with teams, the shepherd might be irritated by someone else on the team, probably more likely the apostle. Because the apostle is always pushing forward, always trying to break new ground, trying to lay the foundations, and they're less interested, not interested, but less interested in the people and who they leave behind their projects. So understanding how these work in teams is really key. My personal view is that if you can create 5Q teams where your leadership team contains some pretty good examples of those things, then that for me would be ideal. But the name 5Q comes from the idea of like IQ or EQ. So EQ would be emotional intelligence. So 5Q is a kind of fivefold intelligence. How do you understand this? How do you understand yourself? How do you understand this working in teams?
Great, yeah. Everyone should have a go and see what they come out as then. Heather and John, do you have anything?
I mean, I did the quiz a few weeks ago after sharing a house with Scott for a week. I felt the pressure, but very interesting. When I did it, it came out that shepherd was the highest score, and I freaked because I'm like, no, that's not me. But what I realised, because I'm married to a pastor, and I've always said for the last 30 years, if you want pastoral care, go and talk to my other half. Don't come and talk to me, because that's just not the way I'm wired. But as you were saying earlier, in terms of seasons, I've realised that at the moment, the season that I'm coming to an end with in my work, I have had to take on that shepherding pastoral role for everybody else that's in my office, because that's what's needed. Now, I've just been thinking about this today, and I think that's why I'm so tired with work at the minute.
Right.
Because I've had to do this, and this is not something that comes naturally to me.
Right.
But I've had, that's who I've needed to be in that situation and for this season.
Yeah.
So, but it's not somewhere where I naturally sit. And I think that probably influenced the way I was answering the questions this time round.
Mm-hmm.
So
that is so interesting. So you were high in it because of life at the moment, but you think if you did it in another time, so it's not your natural.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, did you want to add anything on it? Have you done the quiz too, or?
Yeah, it's probably been almost 10 years since I did the quiz the last time, so probably wouldn't be a bad idea for me to do it again. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because they all came out pretty even. With two of them almost exactly even at the top, which was an interesting thing. But I did find it enlightening. Yeah.
I
Rosie,
did. Yeah, Scott.
do you see somebody's asking where do you do the test? Do you see
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I was just having a look there. I'll put a link in, Mina. I'll put a link in to show you how to do it. And there's a question here from Gavin. In a local church, if you're deficient in any of the 5 ministries, how would you like to develop this?
Yeah, I'll throw something out on that one. It just because one of the things that when I was coming to the understanding that I needed to grow in all 5 of them was because realizing how deficient I was in certain ones. I was pastoring at the time up in Boston. And one of the things I started doing was specifically having people with different kind of emphasis coming into the church to sow in, to release impartation, to help to awaken that in the people that were part of the congregation, so that the grace that was on them would start to kind of spread around, and it would activate what was inherently in someone, but they just hadn't been given the opportunity to express it because they hadn't seen it expressed. But when they found that familiarity, it's like things began to blossom and things began to bloom. And us as a leadership and us as a church, we became a lot more balanced by the infusion of those people that had very strong emphasis in particular arenas. So we did a conference where we had extremely strong teachers, and we had one where we had extremely strong evangelists. We already had a lot of prophetic that was there. We had some with strong apostolic gifting that came in, and we already had some strong pastoral gifting. So we had the ones that we were missing come in and begin to infuse, and it grew the whole team.
Wow.
And that kind of makes sense when you look at Ephesians, doesn't it? Because it's meant to equip the saints for works of service. So that does make sense.
Yeah. Gavin, hope that helps. Let us know. Heather, I thought it was so funny when you said about how you freaked in the test, because I did also as well. And I think my top one was apostle, and I was like, I just couldn't relate to it. And then I was telling Scott and chatting to him about it, and Scott was like, that is such a typical apostle thing to say. You think like you know better than the test. Because I was like, the test is wrong. So it really made me laugh. So it seems like you have a habit of
like, no, I don't want to be a pastor, Shepherd. No.
I know, and I was exactly, yeah. I just find it really funny.
I have to be nice to people.
You are nice to people, actually.
I am most of the time, yeah.
But coming back to Gavin's question, it's a really good question, because part of the issue is how we understand church. If we think church is a gathering place where you're taught and shepherded, guess what emphasis there's going to be?
Yeah.
The emphasis will be on the shepherds and teachers. Yeah. And those are the people that will be brought into leadership roles because that's the need. So how we understand the church really matters in this context, because if you believe the church is a place to hear God, you'll encourage the prophetic. If you believe that the church is a place to do mission to the world, you'll encourage the evangelist. If you believe that the church is meant to be entrepreneurial and breaking ground, you'll encourage the apostolic. And so what I think happens, especially in the West, is that we create silos of gifts. And so you get an apostolic leader who's groundbreaking, and what that does is that gathers other apostolic leaders to them. And so you get a gaggle of apostles. I'm not sure what the collective word is.
Gaggle works. That
we
works
can
well.
mix them up.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's good.
A cathedral of apostles. But you see it a lot in the prophetic movement and in the evangelistic movement. You see the same thing happen.
Mhm.
You see churches that label themselves as, well, we're a prophetic church. And what they tend to do is gather a whole bunch of prophets together, which is not a good recipe.
No, it's not.
Where are the evangelists? Where are the shepherds? Where are the teachers? And, I've heard people say, well, we're a teaching center. We're a Bible-focused church. Well, great. But actually, what you're doing is you're excluding other parts of the body of Christ and other parts of unity and maturity. So I think for Gavin, that idea of recognizing, what is the church for? Who is the church for? And then recognizing you need those gifts, all 5 of those gifts for the church to be really who it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's back to my first point earlier, is that, if you're going to your leadership and you're saying, I've heard this from God, and they're not accepting of the prophetic, then you're going to go somewhere else and find, where that is. Or if you're an evangelist and there's no outlet for that, then you're going to become like a social action activist.
Yeah. Because
that's an outlet for what's in you.
Yeah.
You will find other places if you're not accepted in the church. So yeah, that's my tuppence worth in that before I go on a rabbit trail.
Yeah.
No, it's good. And then the church is missing out, right, as well,
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what tends to happen is that parachurch organizations emerge. So, you get a bunch of evangelists all getting together, and because they're an evangelist, they start recruiting people, and then they start recruiting other evangelists, and then what you've got is a like YWAM or some kind of parachurch organization, and then an organization like YWAM, as an example, 30, 40 years later, they've gathered all these people and they recognize they need shepherded and they need taught. Sorry. And so that's why I'm the low on T.
You need teach.
That was awesome.
I love that.
But they, I know in the UK that YWAM are asking themselves, who are we? Are we church? Are we parachurch? And I think that's the reason why. It's because we need to recognize that all 5 need to be in any organization.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
One of the other things that pops up that I've noticed is you'll have places where if you look around at what people are called, what people are kind of their role that they have as far as their job description, so many times you find the number one job description in most churches, everybody calls the leader of the church pastor. But in reality, most of them, well, I don't know about most of them, but I've run into a lot of people that called themselves pastors that everybody thought was a pastor. It wasn't a pastor.
Yeah.
That was not their gifting. Some were good teachers. Some were great evangelists. A couple were prophetic. Some were apostolic. Prophetic that runs into being pastors. They leading churches. They don't often last very long in one place. They end up moving to another place pretty quickly, from my experience. But you have the problem with labels. Most people, they hear the word pastor and their first thought is the person that leads the church.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because in the Bible, it doesn't actually talk about pastors leading the church. It talks about elders leading the church. It talks about apostles leading the church, but it does not talk about pastors leading the church. But our common conception, common model, if you will, in the West, and it's actually new. It came out of the Reformation in a movement away from. It was an allergy to the Catholic Church and some of the institutionalization, some of the labels that were there. And specifically, I mean, the Catholic Church calling themselves apostolic because of the apostolic succession. And so there was this move away from using the word apostle and pushing away from it. And it was actually just out of a response to error instead of a responds to truth. And whenever we find ourselves responding to an error, we will always end up in equal error. You cannot respond to error. You have to respond to truth. And so just even rethinking, like, I don't know if we have to change the name of what we call it. I mean, I don't call myself pastor, even though I pastor a church. I do care for a church, but I don't use that title because it's not who I am. It's just a role that I'm playing in the moment. And if we can start to reframe some of that language, I think would also help, because we probably have a lot more of these 5 operating than most people think. They're just being called the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe why it's helpful in 5Qs that they talk about shepherds rather than pastors.
Yeah.
So there is that differentiation, and people are not going to get confused with the specific role maybe that it goes with. So yeah.
That's true.
And also to avoid hierarchical thinking, because it's not, that's when you read Ephesians 4, there's none of that concept there. It's quite egalitarian.
Yeah. We've got Gavin saying, thank you, that was helpful, as we've answered his questions. We've got Mina, a question from Mina here. If you do one of the gifts, how do you walk in it or know for sure what you have?
Well, one thing you can do is do the test, which we're going to put a link to.
Yes.
There's 2 other things that you can do. One is test the fruit and ask somebody you trust. So the fruit of an evangelist will be people coming to faith, or sharing the gospel because it's something you're passionate about or comes easy to you. Ask someone, am I an evangelist? They'll say, of course you're an evangelist. That raises some other issues because we've got stereotypes of the gifts. So, evangelist is a classic one where, an immature evangelist will be pretty clumsy, whereas a mature evangelist will be sensitive. And that goes for all 5 of the gifts. An evangelist, for example, is seen as, someone that, stands on a soapbox and tells you you're a sinner. Well, that's a very narrow view of an evangelist. And I think that's true for all of the 5-fold, that we probably need to have a broader, deeper understanding of what they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to Ben's question. I mean, could an apostle be a recruiter as well? Could they gather a team as well?
Who are you asking?
Whoever would like to answer. Who would anyone? I guess maybe, yeah.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Well,
yes, Ben.
My view is that you can be apostolic and not a leader. That you can have apostolic qualities, like you're entrepreneurial, you love starting new things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good leader. The gift of leadership and the gift of apostle, sadly, don't always go together. And so that's why, for me, recognizing the gift and getting the appropriate training, including character development, is really key. So does an apostle gather? Probably. Do they do it well? That depends on their character.
That's good.
Hope that helps you, Ben. Okay, we've got one here.
Good question, Ben.
Yeah. From Jim. When you're training up folk to stream the Fivefold Ministries, what assurance is there that their church have a formation or affirmation to flow in that way? Is there an assurance even? Jim, is that what you're meaning? Does anyone want to pick that one up?
Yeah. Well, I think it really depends on the church. The hope is that churches are places where people come to develop intimacy with God, figure out the goal, the role that God called them to. Who are they? What was the purpose that He created them for? And then explore that, whether it be pastor, evangelist, teacher, prophet, apostle, business leader, whatever that role is. And so the thing that happens is when you have a church that is actually formed in the character of Christ, it gets rid of a lot of the competition and the fear of people actually growing and becoming who they're called to be, because the leader is no longer afraid of losing something because they're just trying to be faithful to Jesus. But when you have insecure or immature leaders, then the likelihood is there's not going to be a place for that, because they're going to try to control all of the ministry themselves and make sure that they don't lose their position, they don't lose their influence, they don't lose their value, because they haven't been settled in the heart of God. So we actually have to deal with something bigger than just this. I mean, just a second ago when Scott was answering the last question, he brought up the whole thing of character. Character formation is so essential, because if we get formation in gifting without character formation, that gifting becomes a danger to everyone around us. We're going to hurt ourselves. We're going to hurt other people. And it's only character that allows us to actually accomplish the purposes of God, that the purpose is that Christ gets formed in us, and Christ looks like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, like these self-giving, this humility that comes with the character of Christ. And so there is a place where, there should be a place where each of these has an access point, has a release point in any local body. But again, that's going to depend on the local body that's hosting it, or that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm thinking to, teaching some of the courses that students have done, like Art of Hearing God, chances are you're getting people coming to that class who are from lots of different churches. So you can't give that guarantee. But what we are doing is training the people to know how to respond, and saying you're here to serve the body. Just because you think you've got a prophetic gifting doesn't mean to say that everybody should jump to your tune. And I think some of the teaching that I've been working through recently with John in terms of emotionally healthy prophetic is looking at how do you respond if you've gone to your pastor, let's just use that word, and said, this is what I think God is saying, and your pastor says no. How do you respond to that in a way that's going to not cause friction, and you're not going off in the huff, and saying, oh, well, I said, because I think there's a time when we need to learn how to respond to criticism as well, because it doesn't matter what our gifting is, or which of the 5Q we feel more naturally we sit with, there will be times when we're criticised or somebody disagrees with us. And it's all part of how do you respond to that. So I think that kind of fits in to what Jim's saying, is that we're trying to teach people how to respond to that without saying, when you go back to your local church, it's all going to be roses and sunshine and it's all going to be brilliant, because you're now flowing in this gifting, whatever you've got. That's not going to be the reality for a lot of people. So I think moving forward, part of it is going to be a definite teaching of for people, how do you respond to this?
I suppose it's a discipleship culture, isn't it? If the church is a discipleship culture, it'll get there in the end, and we have to deal with offense.
Well, no, like even in that passage and the way Jim even said that, there's a key that gets missed. Fivefold Ministries. That word for ministry in the Greek that's used in Ephesians chapter 4, it's literally the work that a slave does. too many times in our modern culture, we think of ministry as an opportunity to have a platform and become popular, to get influence, to be recognized, to be seen. And that is the exact opposite of the biblical picture. The biblical picture is somebody that is called to one of these fivefold, that they get under everybody else and they help the other people become what they're intended, that he who wants to be greatest among you must become the servant of all. And Jesus, knowing who he was, where he was from, and where he was going, took off his outer clothes and wrapped himself with a towel, and he washed his disciples' feet. And when he was done, he said, as I have done to you, so you must do to each other. This place of serving and washing the feet, if we can hold that as the reason for these things, that this is what it is for, is to serve, is to come under, is to love others. It's not about being discovered. It's not about being self-fulfilled. We'll actually have the kind of atmosphere where these things can thrive, and we can see all of them grow up. And then, like Heather was talking about, we serve with what we thought was revelation, but if it's not received, then that's okay. We were serving the other person. If they didn't get help from it, okay, so let's do what they're going to get help from. And then we continue to serve, and it doesn't become an offense, because it's not about identity and it's not about value.
Yeah, that's good.
If you think evangelists' feet are smellier than everyone else's?
Just depends on where they've been.
So many comments of encouragement as well coming in, saying especially, it's important to be teachable, commenting on what you were saying, Heather, as well. People asking about the link. I'll put it on Facebook and YouTube. Catherine's got a question saying, is there a difference between 5Q and gifts? Would anyone like to have a go at that one?
Well, the interesting thing is that I think what we do is we categorize things rather than make them holistic. And there's a real danger that we do that here. Even by saying, I'm an apostle, I'm a this, I'm a, when Faith and I were involved over the years in church planting, a small church planting network in Ghana. And when Faith went over, everyone had a badge, Ministry of Helps, evangelist, whatever. And Faith was like quite resistant to this idea, but because she was in charge of the team, they decided that she was a pastor. So I think we probably need to break out of the categorization mindset. It's a very rational, logical Western way of thinking, and think more holistically. I have the gift of the Spirit. I have the gift of that Christ has given me. And so that would be the way I would approach it.
Yeah. And I think as well, 5Q is more about what the list in Ephesians 4. Whereas if you look in Corinthians and in Romans, there are different lists of gifts in there that are bigger and encompass more things. So it's, I think potentially you could say 5Q is just the Ephesians bit, but that's, I'm thinking Venn diagrams and stuff in my head at the minute. Sort of all 5Q are gifts, but not all gifts are 5Q, that kind of thing.
I'll have to see the diagram. Make it and send it to us.
Rosie, there's another question that Sid has asked there, which I think is very key, which is, are there dangers in specializing too early?
Yes.
I think that's a really important question.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, anyone?
I think the straightforward answer is yes. Because if we label ourselves or we box ourselves in how do we move from base to phase? Like John was saying, how do we move into a different season? Heather's saying, I'm in this context now where I'm having to shepherd. So I think there's a danger that we kind of narrow ourselves into one thing, and that's probably not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we specialize too early, we'll most likely be trying to imitate someone else that we've seen in that specialization. I know, Scott, you're a painter. One of your paintings behind Heather there on the wall. Yeah, beautiful. We've got a very similar painting in our prayer room, actually.
You've got the original, John.
I've got the original. I love that painting, by the way. I love that painting. But if you compare like your painting style with Charity Webb's painting style, and then compare that with Susan Card, or compare that with Picasso or Monet, or like all of a sudden you start realizing you're all painters, but it all looks different.
Yeah.
If you've studied, maybe you studied Rembrandt and you've studied his painting style, and that's what a painter is, and you decide that you're going to specialize as a painter, you may never discover your own voice and how you put colors on the paper and how they come together. You'll constantly be trying to be something else. And what that ends up doing is it actually will hinder your potential of growth. You will squeeze off what could have grown, and because it's fitting into this box, and it never becomes what it was intended. So if you allow yourself just to, instead of trying to figure out right now, well, am I an apostle, am I a prophet, am I an evangelist, shepherd, teacher? How am I following Jesus? And what opportunities is he giving? And 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, you're going to look back and say, wow, I apostled. That's awesome. Wow, I prophesied. That's amazing. Wow, I shepherded people. Wow, I evangelized. And then it's a recognition of what God has done. Looking at these tests and the way we're looking, it helps you to understand how you fit within a team as it's growing, but it's not intended to tell you what you're supposed to be formed into. It's helping you recognize what's currently going on, because the test can't tell you the future. It's only telling you you're answering questions based off of your experience. And what you're going to grow into might change over time. So, yeah.
Or in Heather's case, you might be resistant to it.
I am not that.
I'm just thinking about that. I mean, if we look at Jesus's example, he was a master of all trades. So maybe that's what we've got to aspire to.
Yeah.
Rather than the label, the jack of all trades and master of none, maybe we need to aspire to the master of all trades. In terms of, there are certain situations where I can be an evangelist, and times when I can be a healer, and times when I can be, a prophet and things. And whatever the situation that we're called to at that time, we can pull on that tool and be that person in that situation, rather than say, well, actually, I can't do that because I don't pray for healing because I'm this. So actually said that might be a healthier place to start, is seeing yourself as a jack of all trades.
The other thing is that, we in the West, we tend to individualize things. And every time this is in the context of body, community, others.
Yeah.
So, if in my case, I've had many sort of soul friends and mentors over the years, and often they've come because they have a strength, or they've mastered something, to use your words, Heather. They've mastered something that I've not mastered. So I choose to come alongside them in order to learn from them. So again, for me, 5Q should be done in the context of community.
Yeah.
100%.
What would that look like, Scott?
Well, don't be a lone ranger. Don't. This is one of the dangers of thinking you have a particular gift. So let's take the prophet just as an example, not because I'm picking on you guys. But somebody who discovers they're a prophet, they can become isolated, and then suddenly they're saying things and doing things and setting themselves up in such a way that's actually quite unhealthy. Whereas within a community, a shepherd might come alongside that person and say, by the way, that wasn't very helpful there. Or a teacher might come alongside and say, well, actually, scripturally, I'm not sure that's quite what that means. So it's just good to have that sense of community with the 5Q.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the emphasis that Paul was making in Ephesians chapter 4, because he immediately goes into talking about the body and understanding how we all fit together and we build each other up in love. We're each fulfilling our roles, which allows the whole to become what the whole is supposed to be. And that mature representation of Christ, I mean, that same Greek word, it can mean perfect or complete. It just means that there's nothing lacking. It's that we actually have all the pieces working together, because we're not going to be able to present Christ to the world by all becoming prophets. We're not going to be able to present Christ to the world by all becoming apostles or all becoming pastors or evangelists or shepherds or teachers. Like we need to work together so that we can present the fullness of Christ. And the only way that happens is in connection, which, you know, the picture of the body, the 3 times that Paul uses the metaphor of the church being the body are the 3 times that he talks about spiritual gifts. Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and Ephesians chapter 4. There's a reason for that, because we have different roles, we have different parts, and it's putting us together that allows us to be healthy. A body that's missing a part is called unhealthy. It's diseased. And a part without a body, I mean, if it's not refrigerated and kept kept whole somehow, it's just going to die. It's just going to die. And the only way it will ever fulfill its purpose is to be put into a healthy body where it can receive life and give life. That's for all of us.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. We are about coming to the end of our time. I'm loving all the questions and comments. Lots of people really commenting a lot about the concept of God gives you what you need when. I just wondered, Scott, John and Heather, if there's anything else you want to finally add as we come to an end, if there's any misconceptions you feel about the Fivefold Ministries or anything that you're quite passionate about that you want to add there.
Well, there is a comment that's been made there. Am I just an ordinary Christian, in inverted commas? Just to reinforce that every single person in Christ has the fivefold within their DNA, their spiritual DNA. So there is no clergy, laity, them and us. There's just us. And I think we need to just emphasize that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Thanks, Scott.
I got to just put an exclamation point on what I just said about being part of the body. Like this whole thing of unity, the unity of the body, each part giving what it has and building up the body, being a part of the body. Like it's absolutely essential. When a part of your body starts to reject itself, reject the body, it creates all kinds of disease and pain and issues. And when the body starts to reject a part of itself, it kills that part. And we're intended to mature together into the fullness of the stature of Christ. And if we're going to live out the incarnation, the perfect sinless life, the innocent death, the resurrection, and the ascension, then we all need to come together so that the fullness of the redemption that Jesus Christ purchased for the world, that has started the restoration of all things, can be completed, and that will be seen by us becoming what we're intended to becoming, coming into that mature stature so that the sons of God can be revealed, because all of creation is waiting for that to happen.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes. Good. Anyone else like to add anything else before we? And there are also another couple of questions in there as well. If you wanted to pick up on any.
Someone's asking about if there are no churches around that recognise fivefold. Well, the first thing is that all churches recognise the shepherd and the teacher. So you will find that. And then, depending on your church, I would go to the leadership and say, what's your understanding of this? How could we develop it? Do you see it as being relevant for what we're doing? I think, if you're on this call, God is speaking to you about this, and therefore you can be a person of influence where you are.
Yeah. Just want to say hi, Frederick. Haven't seen you for ages.
Aww.
Nice to meet you all.
That's awesome.
Thanks for your question, Frederick. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and comments. And we can have a look, if we've not had a chance to answer your question, John, Scott and Heather, if you have a chance to go on to either YouTube or Facebook later on, you're welcome to comment. I'll definitely add on the quiz link. I've definitely been enriched by this discussion and shifted my focus a bit on the Fivefold Ministry, especially more community and more holistical way of looking at it. John, Scott, and Heather, thank you so much for joining and answering and responding to lots of questions. And thank you, everyone at home, for watching. Bye, everyone.
Bye now. Take care.